Thank you. Good to see you all this morning. I know that Vicky's already welcomed our guests. If you are our guests and you've parked in the car park, please come and see Vicky or myself, and we'd love to give you some complimentary parking voucher for visiting us today. Over the last few weeks that I've been back, we've been looking at these two key commandments: to love God with all of our heart and soul, and to love one another. And I'm going to continue pressing with that. Particularly, we're focused on loving God, but over the next few weeks, we're looking at really what it means to love each other, and to love our brothers and sisters in Christ, and to love the wider community. And I will be sort of pushing that circle out over the next few weeks. I began a few weeks ago by saying it's so easy, even as Christians, to give lip service to the fact that we love God. It's easy to give lip service to say that we love the people around us. But often, as Steve mentioned earlier before we broke bread, it's easy to misunderstand God because of what we've been led to believe. It's easy to be misunderstood by other people. And it's easy for friction to come into our lives. And we're going to just kind of try and unpack that over the next few weeks. There's just too much for me to try and cover. But you remember a fortnight ago, then we particularly focused on the whole subject, really, of God's commandment for us to love each other. And we're going to stretch that a little bit further. And we looked at two sets of brothers. We looked at Cain and Abel, and the friction that happened within that construct, family construct. And we looked at the prodigal son and his brother. And we'll come back and we're going to look at some other brothers again today. Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all of your heart and with all of your soul and with all of your mind. And this is the first and greatest commandment. Now the second is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments." So we return now to the second of these two commandments. Last week, 2 weeks ago, as I said, we looked at Cain and Abel, and the prodigal and his brother. And these two sets of brothers highlighted the love-hate relationship. And I use that phrase very carefully, the love-hate relationship that we can so easily fall into or fall out of as we try to get on well with each other. Cain had another complicated process because his offering, it wasn't accepted by God, and that seemed to get under his skin. And he became very jealous of his brother. And I tried to kind of dig a little bit deeper. Why was his offering not accepted? And it seemed to be an offering to placate God in order to try and win God's favour. And yet Abel's offering was an offering of simplicity. However, Cain's offering was a slippery slope of starting to hate his brother, and it eventually caused him to take his life. The older brother in the Lord's parable believed that he was slaving away for his father year after year after year. And for that very reason, his attitude stopped him from going into the party and enjoying the moment. And there's two important aspects of those two incidents, and I don't want to repeat the last sermon, but it all comes down to our attitude and our heart and what we believe about God and what we believe about others. And Steve's opening line on this very subject is very important, because sometimes we get into our heads things that are simply not true. In both of these stories, the other brother had a bad attitude, and that led to misery, bad decision making, and exclusion from God's best. Brotherly love has to train itself It's not something that we just talk about, but it's a discipline. And it has to train itself to see the best in other people and to see the best in God. Philippians 2:3 says, "Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others more important than yourselves." I've managed to do that a couple of times a month. It is quite hard to do because we are by very nature selfish and quite egocentric, and we want the world to revolve around us. And we have to keep on checking ourselves. And once we get out of sync of conversation or relationship, then things can very quickly nosedive and go from bad to worse. I turn our attention to some other brothers in the Bible, because the last two set were just the beginning of brotherly friction. Jacob and Esau. Jacob and Esau seemed to be in a state of animosity from pretty much the day that they were born. Okay, they just didn't seem to get on well with each other, these two brothers. And when the time came for her, they were twins, of course, and when the time came for her to give birth, they were twins in her womb. And in verse 41, the days of we're going to jump to that. So there is a beginning when he says that Jacob came out of his mother's womb, grabbing the heel of his brother. And Jacob means one who grabs the heel of another. And then we jump to the very end of their narrative, or close to the end of their narrative, when Jacob again stole his brother's blessing. And Esau says, "The days of mourning for my father are near, and then I will kill him." And then I will kill him. So here we have this incredible story again, where these two brothers were constantly at each other's heels. I'll just go back to the text itself. "And when the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. And the first to come out was red, and his whole body was like a hairy garment. So they named him Esau. And after this, his brother came out with his hand grasping Esau's heel. So he named him Jacob." It means to grasp the heel of another. And it just seems sometimes that people come into our lives and they're just nipping at our heels. They're just there to get on our nerves. They're there to cause friction. We talk about love. Next week we're going to address this very complicated subject of forgiveness. But it's easier to say I've forgiven you than we see that person in the street or at church, and then we realise that we really haven't forgiven them because we still actually want to wring their necks. And it says the boys grew up, and Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the open country, while Jacob was content to stay at home among the tents. Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. See these tensions of the different dynamics of love that were going on between mother and father and both the sons. One day Jacob was cooking some stew, and Esau came in from the open country. He was starving, and he said to Jacob, "Quick, let me have some of your red stew. I am famished." And Jacob says, "Sell me your birthright." "Look, I'm about to die here," Esau said. "What good is a birthright to me?" But Jacob said, "Swear to me." And he swore an oath to him, selling him his birthright for a pot of stew. And Jacob gave Esau some bread and some lentil stew, and he ate it, and he drank, and he got up, and he left. And thereafter Esau despised his birthright. See how things can happen in life. People cheat us. People deceive us. People do wrong to us. And we've got to try and work out how we're going to manage that. How are we going to navigate and weave through those broken relationships? Later on, when their father was just about to die, and Esau asked for his oldest son to go out and get some game for him. And again, Jacob connivingly stole that opportunity. And Jacob came in with the stew, and because his father was almost blind, he couldn't see which son it was, and he was confused because the voice was different. He was saying, a bit of a sore throat, and and he'd covered his hands with hair from an animal and pretended to be him. And he stole the final blessing of his father. Isn't he rightly named Jacob? This is the second time he's taken advantage of me. He has taken my birthright, and now he has taken my blessing. And later on, Esau held a grudge against Jacob because of the blessing his father had given him. And he said to himself, the days of my mourning my father are near, and I will kill him. I don't think any of us are quite at the stage where we actually want to kill somebody. But that feeling inside where things just get on top of you, and you want the person to be out of your life. You've just had enough. And that there's an individual or a group of people or a set of circumstances that are just, they're wrapped around your life like a spider's web, and you can't escape from it. And every waking hour, as you're becoming restless and frustrated and angry. And it's beginning to change how you see other people. And mistrust and unhappiness and all sorts of other emotional consequences take place because it puts us out of sync with God, and it puts us out of sync with the people that we love, and it causes depression. And we just start getting the grumps because we're not managing the circumstances, because other people are taking certain courses of action which are making us happy. And this is a weird thing about the Bible. Because the Bible never lays the blame on the offender, but it always talks to the offended in order to have the right attitude. And that seems unfair to me. If your brother offends you, you go and put it right. Why should I have to go and put it right? They've been the stinkers. And yet I have to do the dirt. I have to go and raise this matter with them. Why should I have to do that? It's been my experience that half the time that people offend me, I haven't even realised that they've offended me. And I'm carrying a grudge because of that. And that's where the rubber hits the road. And sometimes just sitting down and having a coffee and talking things through and praying for their blessing is so important. It's a bit of a happy ending, but an unusual ending. After Esau died, Jacob had to flee. And he was away for about 30 years. He had a family now. And all his wives. And he decided to go back home, but he knew that Esau was there. And he knew that Esau wanted to have his head. And he was worried about that, rightly so, because Esau had vowed that he was going to kill him. And so he got his 4 wives and the children, and he sent them ahead with cattle, with groceries, and with food. And he says, you go out and meet Jacob first. And he kept sending all of these gifts again to try and to placate his brother. It seemed that Jacob had the issue now and not Esau. And Jacob looked up, and there was Esau coming with his 400 men. So he divided the children among Leah, Rachel, and the 2 female servants. And he put the female servants and their children in front, and Leah and her children next. And then Joseph at the rear, and he himself went on ahead and bowed down to the ground as he approached his brother. But Esau ran out to meet Jacob, and he embraced him. He threw his arms around his neck and he kissed him, and they wept with each other. And Esau looked up and he saw the women and children. Who are these who are with you? They are the children of God, they are the children that God has graciously given your servant. Jacob is such an unusual character. He really was one of the scoundrels of the Bible. He stole, he told porkies, he didn't do well. And yet, somehow, God loved Jacob. God loved Jacob. And that really humbles me, because Jacob didn't treat his brother well. And yet, somehow, Jacob was the one that was loved. And he exemplifies the mercy of God, who draws out the very best of flawed men and women. It's remarkable. It's interesting that Jacob, with all of his flaws and all of his cheating, and he basically lied to his father on his deathbed and stole that blessing from his father. It's always a mystery, because Esau cried out and says, "Have you got he lied, he cheated, he stole this." And Esau says, "I've said it now, and he will be blessed." And I can't get my head around why you would get a blessing out of, because you stole it. And yet, Jacob became a patriarch of Judaism. So important that for the rest of the millennia thereafter, God would be known as the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. It just gives me shivers to think that this deviant, that God was preparing them to be one of the patriarchs of this great nation. I don't have time to go in to talk about Joseph and his brothers, but when his brothers saw their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him, and they could not speak a kind word to him. It seems that brothers in the Bible didn't get on that well with each other. They hated him. And it's difficult to talk about jealousy, because I think we're all a wee bit more mature to think that we wouldn't be envious. But sometimes other people can have gifts, and other people can have ministries, and other people can have it more together than we are. And we've been praying for 5 years or 10 years, and there's been no deliverance, there's been no provision for us, and God seems to treat other people better. Even David says, even the ungodly seem to have it better than us who walk in the ways of the Lord. And sometimes that can skew our view of God. It begins to distort our view of God. We talk about God is good all the time, but actually, when we're in the blues and when we're feeling sorry for ourselves, it doesn't always feel like that. And because time doesn't allow me, and we don't have time to go on into the story of Joseph and how he was taken down into Egypt and imprisoned, and all came out of this situation because his brothers hated him. And you think to yourself, and yet God had a plan for that. And it says in Genesis 50:20, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to what he is now going to accomplish, the saving of many lives." We have this New Testament construct called love, and we have to love each other. And we need to look at what the high level of the requirement of that love. But I want to say that these 4 stories that we've had, the 2 last week and these 2, what we discover is that a lack of love creates an emotional vacuum. And that vacuum leads to some kind of emotional disconnect. Either pain or cruelty or anger or loneliness or resentment or jealousy. Because when we don't feel loved and we feel unloved, it begins to change our worldview. And it takes us further away from the light into the darkness. And so this whole idea of loving one another is not just so that we can be, happy-go-lucky Christians. It's so that God can bring absolute and total completion into our maturity and into our emotional fulfillment in Him and with each other. I've shared it before, but I'll do it again. We know the story of those who were given talents to use for God. His master replied, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things, and I will put you in charge of many things. Come in and share your master's happiness." And then the man who had received 1 bag of gold came and said, "Master, I knew that you were a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered. So I was afraid, and I went out and I hid your gold. See, here is what belongs to you." It wasn't the servant. It wasn't the fact that what the servant did by burying the gold in the ground that got him into trouble. It's what he believed about God that got him into trouble. His misplaced thoughts about God led to bad actions, and his bad actions got him into trouble. And so we need to have a high view of God and a high view of each other. Because when things become skewed and distorted, whether it's God or each other, then it begins to lead to pain, discontentment, disassociation, and frustration. And so we need to truly begin to see what this word love actually means. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but it rejoices with the truth. It always protects, it always trusts, it always hopes, it always perseveres. We'll come back to, let's have a look at them. Just to try, not quite at the close of it, but what does it mean to love others, to focus on what we have in common and not on our differences? To be realistic in our expectations. You need to learn to love really annoying people, because you might be one of them. You need to choose to encourage rather than to criticize. You need to practice God's plan for resolving issues. You need to refuse to listen to gossip. Anyone who loves his brother and sister lives in the light, and there is nothing in them that will make them stumble. Do you see the correlation here between peace and joy and revelation and the right relationship that we have with one another? I grew up in quite a large family. I don't often talk about that. I've got 3 brothers. I had 3 brothers. One died of alcoholism. I never really got to know him growing up. Got another brother. His name's Robert. I've not met him for 30 years. I think he lives in Indonesia or somewhere else in the world. I'm not even too sure if he's still alive. We've tried to kind of search for him, and without success in that, my sister's tried at times to keep in contact with him. I've got a sister who hasn't spoken to me for 12 years. Hasn't spoken to me for 12 years. That is an unsettling thing for me, because I'm of the light. I'm supposed to be an example of reconciliation and restoration. And we've never quite been able to resolve those differences. I've got another brother who I'm quite close to. The only problem I've got with him is he really doesn't like foreign people. I don't know how to bring that up, because it's quite serious. You only have to speak to him for 10 minutes, and you just think to yourself, oh my goodness. And I'm close to him. Families are so complex. And I'm just, in many ways, because I moved away to England, I kind of nearly, I'm away from it. But there's a call to our roots. There's a call and a process. And what has happened to my biological journey impacts my spiritual journey. And how I try and unravel some of those knots. How do I learn to love the unlovable? Because to unlove the unlovable, see, Jesus says it's easy to love your friends. It's easy to love your friends. But how, not just your enemies, we'll get to the enemies now and in the weeks to come, but how do you love the unlovable? Because that is what separates us from the world of self-serving love and selfish love. To share Christ's love with people who have no apparent ability to return anything at all back to you. It almost seems out of our grasp. Jesus calls us to love as he loved. To love those who finished last. To love those who are ugly in the inside. Those who are poor, those who are powerless, those who have been ostracized, those who have been disadvantaged. It's this kind of love that releases a supernatural transformation through the church and raises us to a new state of supernatural interaction with a world of hatred and anger and separation. It separates us from the animal kingdom, who often will fight and attack and retaliate and eat each other. It transcends human responses to a new level of heavenly interaction. It releases God's light. It demonstrates God's character. And it draws the world closer to us. Because people are desperate to be loved. I learned this from a friend many years ago, but I still struggle with it. We must love others without stopping to inquire whether or not they deserve it. Loving our enemies is more than just trying to get on with people that we find annoying. But when Jesus uses the word enemy, ekros, it means our adversaries, our foes. It tells us to love even those who are out to get us. Those who will try and get us fired at work. those in-laws who haven't spoken to us for decades, the neighbour who you suspect scratched your car. We are called to love those who are filled with animosity towards us. It's a complex business. As I close this morning, there's one other brother I want to talk to you about today. He's not ashamed to call me his brother. I sometimes just feel so that in all the things I've spoken to today, because there's a little bit of me in all of those stories. There's a little bit of Esau. There's a little bit of Jacob. There's a little bit of a prodigal brother. There's a little bit of all of them in me. And he is not ashamed of me. My brother Jesus. I'll close with that.